The setup Marcus Wellington had always believed that attention was the currency of politics. At 42, he had clawed his way from a small-town council member to a state representative, and now he had his sights set on the governor's mansion. The problem was nobody seemed to care about Marcus Wellington anymore. His poll numbers had been sliding for months. The media had grown tired of his predictable soundbites and carefully rehearsed outrage. Social media influencers half his age commanded more followers than his official accounts. Even his own campaign manager had started taking longer lunch breaks and returning his calls with less enthusiasm. Marcus sat in his cramped campaign office on a dreary Tuesday morning, scrolling through news feeds that barely mentioned his name. The office smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Campaign posters featuring his forced smile hung crookedly on the walls, and boxes of unused flyers gathered dust in the corners. His assistant, Jenny, a 20-something political science graduate who had taken the job hoping to change the world, now spent most of her time updating his calendar with increasingly sparse appointments. The breaking point came when Marcus discovered that a viral video of a cat playing piano had received more online engagement in one day than his entire campaign had generated in the past month. He slammed his laptop shut with such force that Jenny looked up from her desk with concern. "Sir, is everything all right?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and stared out at the busy street below. People hurried past without a second glance at the campaign signs in his window. A food truck on the corner had a longer line than his last town hall meeting had attendees. "I need something big, Jenny," Marcus finally said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge of determination. "Something that will make people remember my name." Jenny had worked in politics long enough to recognize that tone. It was the sound of a desperate candidate about to make a terrible decision. She had seen it before with other politicians who had lost their way, chasing headlines instead of serving constituents. "Maybe we should focus on the issues that matter to voters," she suggested carefully. "Healthcare, education, the economy." Marcus turned from the window with a look that made Jenny's stomach drop. "Issues don't trend on social media, Jenny. Issues don't make the evening news. You know what does? Drama, controversy, something so outrageous that people can't ignore it." Over the next few days, Marcus became obsessed with finding his moment. He researched every political stunt that had ever gone viral, from legislators walking out of sessions to politicians getting arrested for publicity. He studied the anatomy of viral moments, analyzing what made some stories explode across the internet while others faded into obscurity. His research led him down increasingly desperate rabbit holes. He watched videos of politicians making fools of themselves, sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally. He read about the fine line between attention-grabbing and career-ending, though in his current state of mind, he wasn't sure he cared about the distinction anymore. The idea began to form during a sleepless night spent doom-scrolling through social media. Marcus had been watching compilation videos of various ceremonial events when he stumbled across footage of the famous royal guards at Buckingham Palace. These stoic figures, standing motionless despite tourists trying everything to make them react, represented something that frustrated him deeply: unwavering dignity in the face of chaos. Marcus had always resented people who seemed immune to the desperate scramble for attention that consumed his world. Politicians, celebrities, influencers, everyone was fighting for their 15 minutes of fame. But these guards just stood there, silent and immovable, somehow commanding more respect through their stillness than Marcus had ever achieved through all his noise. And twisted idea began to take shape in his mind. What if he found a way to break that composure? What if he could be the person who finally made one of these legendary guards react? The internet would go crazy. The story would be everywhere. Foreign news outlets would pick it up. His name would be known around the world. Marcus spent the rest of the night researching everything he could about the Royal Guards. He learned about their training, their discipline, their role in British culture. He watched video after video of tourists trying and failing to get reactions from them. Each failed attempt only convinced him more that succeeding where others had failed would guarantee him the attention he craved. By morning, Marcus had convinced himself that this was his ticket back to relevance. He imagined the headlines, the interviews, the book deals that might follow. Sure, there might be some controversy, but controversy was just another word for publicity in his world. Jenny arrived at the office to find Marcus pacing excitedly, his eyes bright with the manic energy of someone who had discovered what they believed to be the perfect plan. Campaign materials lay scattered across his desk, pushed aside to make room for printed articles about British ceremonial traditions and tourist guides to London. "Jenny, how quickly can we arrange a trip to London?" Marcus asked, before she had even set down her purse. "London? Sir, we don't have the budget for international travel, and I'm not sure how a foreign trip fits into a state campaign strategy." Marcus waved off her concerns with the dismissive gesture of someone who had already made up his mind. "This isn't about the campaign budget, Jenny. This is about making history. Sometimes you have to invest in your future." Looking back, Jenny would remember this moment as the last opportunity she had to talk Marcus out of what came next. She could see the dangerous gleam in his eyes, the same look she had witnessed in other politicians who had crossed the line from ambitious to reckless. But Marcus Wellington was beyond reasoning with at this point. His desperation had transformed into what he mistook for inspiration, and nothing Jenny could say would change his mind. The plan was set in motion that very day, with Marcus booking a flight to London using his personal credit card and telling everyone who would listen that he was going on a fact-finding mission to study international government protocols. It sounded official enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but vague enough to give him the freedom he needed to execute his scheme. What Marcus didn't realize as he finalized his travel arrangements was that his moment of viral fame was indeed waiting for him in London, just not in the way he had imagined. The journey Marcus Wellington's flight to London departed on a foggy Thursday morning. As he settled into his economy seat, a compromise forced by his dwindling campaign funds, he felt a mixture of excitement and nervous energy that he hadn't experienced in years. Other passengers around him scrolled through their phones or dozed off, but Marcus was wide awake, mentally rehearsing his plan and imagining the global attention it would bring him. He had told his wife, Carol, that he was attending a series of meetings with international political consultants. The lie came easily after months of desperate campaigning had already strained their relationship. Carol had stopped asking detailed questions about his activities weeks ago, worn down by his increasingly erratic behavior and obsessive focus on poll numbers. During the 8-hour flight, Marcus refined his strategy. He had studied dozens of videos showing tourists attempting to distract the guards at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and the Tower of London. Most tried the usual tactics, making faces, telling jokes, or performing silly dances. A few had attempted more aggressive approaches, shouting or waving objects only to be quickly removed by security. Marcus believed his approach would be different because he was different. He wasn't just another tourist seeking a reaction for a vacation video. He was a politician, someone who understood power and authority. He convinced himself that his status gave him a unique opportunity to succeed where others had failed. The UI plan was simple in concept but required precise execution. Marcus would approach one of the guards during a busy tourist period, when maximum witnesses would be present. He would engage in what appeared to be normal tourist behavior at first, taking photos and admiring the ceremony. Then he would escalate, his attempts to get a reaction, building up to a dramatic physical gesture that would break the guard's composure and create the viral moment he desperately needed. Marcus had even prepared his follow-up statements for the inevitable interviews. He would frame it as a social experiment, a demonstration of American boldness versus British stuffiness. He had talking points about cultural differences and the importance of challenging authority. In his mind, he would become a folk hero, the politician who dared to do what millions of tourists only dreamed of doing. When the plane landed at Heathrow, Marcus felt like he was stepping into destiny. London's grey skies and bustling atmosphere energized him in a way that his hometown hadn't in months. He checked into a modest hotel near Victoria Station, chosen specifically for its proximity to Buckingham Palace, and spent his first evening walking the area, scouting locations and timing security patrols. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Perfect weather for tourists, and Marcus hoped, perfect lighting for the videos that would document his moment of triumph. He dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that would photograph well while still allowing him freedom of movement. A navy blazer over khakis gave him a respectable appearance that he hoped would allow him to get closer to his target before security intervened. Marcus arrived at Buckingham Palace just as the morning shift of guards was taking their positions. The familiar red tunics and tall black bearskin hats were already drawing crowds of tourists, cameras clicking and phones recording as visitors tried to capture the perfect shot of British pomp and ceremony. He spent the first hour observing, noting the patterns of the guards' movements, the positioning of security cameras, and the typical tourist behavior that guards were accustomed to ignoring. Marcus was impressed despite himself by the guards' discipline. They stood absolutely still despite the chaos around them, children running past, tour groups chattering loudly, and countless flash photographs going off inches from their faces. One guard in particular caught Marcus's attention. The man appeared to be in his mid-20s, with the rigid posture and thousand-yard stare that had become iconic symbols of British military tradition. He stood at his post near the palace gates, seemingly oblivious to the world around him despite being one of the most photographed people in London that day. This would be Marcus's target. As the crowd grew thicker with the arrival of tour buses, Marcus began implementing the first phase of his plan. He approached the guard's position with his phone out, mimicking the behavior of countless other tourists. He took several photos, gradually moving closer with each shot. The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Marcus then began what he thought of as the escalation phase. He started talking to the guard, making comments about the weather, asking questions about the uniform, complimenting the precision of the ceremony. His voice grew slightly louder with each attempt, but the guard maintained his professional silence. Other tourists had begun to notice Marcus's more persistent behavior. Some moved closer, perhaps hoping to witness or film whatever he was planning to do next. Others seemed uncomfortable with his increasingly aggressive approach and moved away, though they continued to watch from a distance. Marcus felt a rush of adrenaline as he realized he was becoming the center of attention. This was exactly what he had hoped for, an audience for his grand gesture. He could see people holding up their phones, recording his interaction with the guard. Soon, he told himself, these would be the videos that made him famous around the world. The guard, for his part, continued to demonstrate the legendary discipline that had made his unit famous. Despite Marcus's increasingly bold attempts to engage him, the young soldier maintained his composure with a professionalism that would have been admirable under different circumstances. Marcus interpreted the guard's continued silence as a challenge rather than professional duty. In his mind, this had become a battle of wills, and backing down now would mean returning to America as the same ignored politician he had been when he left. That was unacceptable. As tourists continued to gather and cameras continued to record, Marcus prepared for the final phase of his plan. He had studied enough viral incidents to know that this was the moment that would define everything that followed. Success would mean global recognition and the revival of his political career. Failure would mean, well, Marcus had convinced himself that failure wasn't an option. The guard continued to stand at attention, unaware that he was about to become the unwilling participant in one American politician's desperate grab for fame. The crowd of onlookers grew larger, drawn by the obvious tension building in the scene before them. Marcus took a deep breath and prepared to cross the line that would change both their lives forever. In his mind, he was about to become the man who finally broke the legendary composure of a British royal guard. What he didn't realize was that he was about to learn a very painful lesson about the difference between discipline and weakness, and about the consequences of mistaking restraint for vulnerability. The confrontation, the moment of truth, arrived at 11:47 a.m. London time, captured by no fewer than 17 different phones and cameras held by tourists who sensed something dramatic was about to unfold. Marcus Wellington stood barely 3 feet from the royal guard, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror as he prepared to execute the final phase of his plan. The guard, whose name Marcus would later learn from news reports, was Lance Corporal James Mitchell, a 24-year-old veteran of 2 overseas deployments, remained perfectly still. His eyes stared straight ahead with the unwavering focus that had been drilled into him through months of rigorous training. He had dealt with difficult tourists before, but something about this particular American's behavior set off alarm bells in his mind. Marcus had spent the past 10 minutes building up to this moment, his attempts to provoke a reaction growing, progressively more desperate and aggressive. What had started as seemingly innocent tourist chatter had evolved into increasingly personal comments and inappropriate gestures. The crowd around them had grown larger and more uncomfortable as they witnessed Marcus's behavior escalate beyond the bounds of normal tourist enthusiasm. "I know you can hear me," Marcus said loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I know you want to react. Why don't you just admit that this whole silent treatment is just an act?" Lance Corporal Mitchell had faced down hostile crowds in conflict zones overseas. He had maintained his composure through exhausting ceremonies in blazing heat and freezing rain. He had been trained to handle every conceivable situation that might arise while on ceremonial duty. But nothing in his training had quite prepared him for dealing with an increasingly unhinged American politician who seemed determined to create an international incident. Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording a selfie video with the guard in the background. "This is Marcus Wellington coming to you live from London, where I'm about to do something that no American politician has ever done before," he announced to his phone's camera, loud enough for everyone around him to hear. Security personnel had been monitoring the situation for several minutes, but royal protocol required them to allow a certain amount of tourist interaction with the guards before intervening. They were positioned strategically around the area, ready to move quickly if the situation escalated beyond acceptable limits. Unfortunately for Marcus, he was about to cross that line in spectacular fashion. Marcus approached even closer to the guard, now standing close enough to touch him. The crowd fell unusually quiet, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Children were pulled closer to their parents, and several tourists stepped back to create a wider circle around the unfolding drama. "You know what I think?" Marcus said, his voice now carrying a sharp edge that made even veteran tourists uncomfortable. "I think this whole thing is just British arrogance. I think you believe you're better than everyone else because you can stand still and ignore people." Lance Corporal Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that Marcus's words were having any effect at all. His training had taught him to ignore insults and provocations, but Marcus was pushing boundaries that most tourists respected instinctively. The American's behavior was becoming genuinely threatening rather than merely annoying. Marcus misinterpreted the guard's continued silence as vindication of his approach. In his desperation-clouded mind, he believed he was on the verge of achieving the breakthrough that would make him famous. He had traveled thousands of miles and invested his last available funds in this moment, and he was not going to let it pass without achieving his goal. "I bet I can make you move," Marcus announced loudly, turning briefly to ensure the crowd was still watching and recording. "I bet I can make you break that famous British discipline." What happened next unfolded, in slow motion, captured from multiple angles by the phones and cameras of horrified tourists. Marcus, driven by months of political desperation and convinced of his own cleverness, made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He reached out and shoved Lance Corporal Mitchell hard in the chest. The push was forceful enough to cause the guard to take a small step backward to maintain his balance. For a brief moment, Marcus felt a surge of triumph. He had done it. He had made one of the famous royal guards move. The crowd gasped audibly, and Marcus could hear the rapid clicking of camera shutters capturing the moment. But Marcus's celebration was premature and short-lived. Lance Corporal Mitchell, trained in combat techniques and carrying the full authority of his position, responded exactly as his training dictated when faced with physical assault. His reaction was swift, professional, and devastating. In one fluid motion, the guard stepped forward, grabbed Marcus by the shoulder, and executed a textbook restraint technique that sent the politician sprawling to the ground with a force that knocked the wind out of his lungs and sent his phone skittering across the courtyard pavement. The crowd's gasps turned to shocked silence, then to excited chatter as people realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary. But it wasn't the kind of extraordinary that Marcus had planned for. As Marcus lay on the cold stone ground, struggling to breathe and trying to process what had just happened, he became aware of several things simultaneously. First, his right wrist was bent at an angle that definitely wasn't normal, and pain was shooting up his arm. Second, the circle of tourists around him had grown much larger, and every single person seemed to be recording video of his humiliation. Third, several very serious-looking security personnel were approaching rapidly. Lance Corporal Mitchell had already returned to his position and resumed his stoic stance, as if nothing had happened. But something had definitely happened, and Marcus Wellington was about to discover just how thoroughly his plan had backfired. The crowd began to murmur excitedly as they realized what they had witnessed. This wasn't just a tourist getting a reaction from a guard. This was an American politician who had just been professionally and decisively dealt with by one of Britain's finest. As Marcus struggled to sit up, cradling his injured wrist, he could hear fragments of conversation from the crowd around him. Words like unbelievable, did you see that, and serves him right, drifted through his pain-fogged consciousness. These were not the reactions of people who saw him as a folk hero challenging authority. These were the reactions of people who had just watched someone get exactly what they deserved. Security personnel reached Marcus's position and began the process of removing him from the area, while ensuring he received appropriate medical attention for his injury. As they helped him to his feet, Marcus caught a glimpse of Lance Corporal Mitchell, who remained at his post with the same unwavering discipline he had shown throughout the entire incident. The guard had not been broken. Marcus Wellington, on the other hand, most definitely had been. The aftermath. The emergency room at St. Thomas's Hospital was not where Marcus Wellington had imagined spending his afternoon in London. As he sat on an examination table, waiting for X-ray results while a stern-faced constable took notes nearby, he began to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. His right wrist throbbed with a pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his mounting panic. The videos had already begun their viral journey across the internet before Marcus had even reached the hospital. Within 30 minutes of the incident, multiple angles of his humiliating encounter with Lance Corporal Mitchell were spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. The hashtag #DarnPoliticianDown was trending on Twitter, and news outlets around the world were beginning to pick up the story. Dr. Sarah Chen, the emergency physician treating Marcus, delivered the news with professional detachment. "You have a fractured wrist, Mr. Wellington. The good news is that it's a clean break and should heal properly with proper treatment. The bad news is that you'll need a cast for at least 6 weeks, and you should avoid any strenuous activity during that time." Marcus nodded numbly, barely processing the medical information. His mind was focused on damage control, though he was beginning to realize that there might not be any way to control this particular kind of damage. The constable had already informed him that while no formal charges were being pressed, the incident being deemed a case of lawful restraint in response to assault, he would be required to provide a statement and could potentially face civil penalties. "Mr. Wellington," the constable said, consulting his notebook, "I need to confirm a few details for our report. You are Marcus Wellington, currently serving as a state representative in the United States, correct?" The confirmation of his identity felt like another nail in the coffin of his political career. Marcus had hoped against hope that he might somehow remain anonymous, that perhaps the story would die down before anyone connected the humiliated tourist to the struggling politician. But that hope died as soon as he was forced to provide his official identification. Back at Buckingham Palace, Lance Corporal Mitchell continued his duty rotation as if nothing unusual had occurred. His commanding officers had already reviewed the incident and determined that his response had been entirely appropriate and professional. The guard's reputation, if anything, had been enhanced by his handling of the situation. Marcus, meanwhile, was discovering that his own reputation was undergoing a very different kind of transformation. The first news alert appeared on Marcus's phone while he was still having his cast applied. "American politician assaults British Royal Guard, gets instant justice," read the headline from a major news website. The story included an embedded video compilation showing multiple angles of the incident, with Marcus's shove and subsequent takedown played on repeat. Jenny, Marcus's campaign assistant, had been fielding calls from reporters for the past hour. She had tried calling Marcus repeatedly, but he had turned off his phone after the third news alert appeared. Back in their home state, the local media was already running the story as their lead, with political commentators expressing shock and embarrassment at Marcus's behavior. "This is absolutely inexcusable conduct from someone who is supposed to represent our state," said Rebecca Morrison, a political science professor who had often criticized Marcus in the past. "To go to another country and assault a member of their military is not just personally humiliating, it's diplomatically embarrassing for all Americans." Social media had exploded with reactions ranging from outrage to mockery. The video had been shared thousands of times, with users adding their own commentary and memes. "British Guard delivers swift justice to American politician" had become the most watched video on several platforms, with view counts climbing into the millions. Marcus's political opponents were having a field day. His primary challenger, Sarah Chen, no relation to the emergency room doctor, held an impromptu press conference to address the situation. "This incident shows exactly the kind of judgment and character that Marcus Wellington brings to public office," she said, standing in front of a campaign banner. "While I'm in our state working on solutions to healthcare costs and education funding, he's in London embarrassing our entire community on the world stage." The international reaction was swift and brutal. British newspapers initially reporting the story as a curious incident involving an overly aggressive tourist quickly pivoted when they learned of Marcus's political status. "American politician's London tantrum ends in tears," read the headline in The Sun, accompanied by a series of photos showing Marcus on the ground, clutching his wrist. Even more damaging were the think pieces that began appearing in major publications, analyzing what the incident revealed about American politics and culture. The desperate politics of viral fame explored how social media had created incentives for increasingly outrageous political behavior. When politicians become performing seals, examined the broader trend of elected officials prioritizing attention over governance. Marcus finally turned his phone back on during his taxi ride back to the hotel and was immediately overwhelmed by the volume of notifications. Dozens of missed calls from reporters, hundreds of text messages from colleagues and constituents, and thousands of social media notifications created a digital tsunami of attention. Exactly what he had wanted, but in the worst possible way. His wife Carol had left 17 voicemails, her tone progressing from concern to confusion to anger as the day wore on. "Marcus, I just saw the news. Please call me immediately," began the first message. By the 17th, her voice was cold with fury. "I cannot believe you would embarrass our family like this. I cannot believe you would lie to me about why you went to London. We need to talk immediately when you get home." The hotel lobby was eerily quiet when Marcus returned, though he noticed several guests whispering and pointing in his direction. The desk clerk, who had been friendly that morning, now avoided eye contact as Marcus passed by. Word had clearly spread even to the hotel staff about their infamous American guest. In his room, Marcus sat on the bed and forced himself to confront the full scope of the disaster he had created. The video had been viewed millions of times. His name was trending globally. News outlets on multiple continents were running the story. Political commentators were using his incident as evidence of everything wrong with modern American politics. But perhaps most devastating of all was the realization that he had achieved exactly what he had set out to achieve. He had gotten the world's attention. He had created a viral moment. He had made headlines around the globe. Marcus Wellington was now one of the most famous politicians in America. The only problem was that he was famous for all the wrong reasons. As he sat in his London hotel room, cradling his broken wrist and scrolling through endless mocking commentary about his failed stunt, Marcus began to understand that he had not just broken his wrist in that confrontation with Lance Corporal Mitchell. He had broken his political career, his reputation, and quite possibly his marriage. The viral fame he had so desperately sought was his, but it came with a price he was only beginning to calculate. The reckoning Marcus Wellington's flight home was scheduled for Saturday morning, but by Friday evening he realized that returning to his home state might be more challenging than leaving it had been. The story had continued to grow throughout the week, morphing from a simple viral video into a full-blown political scandal that threatened to engulf not just his career, but his entire life. The hotel room had become his prison. Room service staff knocked tentatively and left quickly, their professional smiles unable to hide their recognition of the infamous American guest. Marcus had stopped leaving the room after his first and only attempt to visit the hotel restaurant resulted in other diners openly filming him eating breakfast. Their phones held up without any pretense of discretion. The political fallout back home had been swift and merciless. By Thursday, 3 major donors had publicly withdrawn their support from his gubernatorial campaign. The state party chairman had issued a statement calling Marcus's behavior deeply concerning and completely contrary to the values we represent. 2 fellow legislators had called for his resignation from his current office, despite the fact that the incident had occurred on foreign soil during what was technically personal time. Jenny had quit via email on Wednesday, her resignation letter, brief but devastating. "I cannot in good conscience continue to work for someone whose judgment is so fundamentally flawed," she wrote. What happened in London was not a momentary lapse. It was the inevitable result of months of increasingly desperate and unethical decision-making. I wish you well in your recovery, but I cannot be part of whatever comes next. The loss of Jenny felt like losing his last connection to the political world he had worked so hard to enter. She had been more than just a campaign assistant. She had been his link to younger voters, his guide to social media trends, and increasingly, his conscience when his own moral compass seemed to malfunction. Her resignation letter had been leaked to the press within hours, adding another layer of humiliation to his growing pile of public shame. Marcus had spent Thursday night crafting what he hoped would be a redemptive statement, an explanation that might help people understand his motivations and perhaps salvage something from the wreckage of his reputation. Draft after draft filled his laptop screen, each attempt seeming more pathetic than the last. "I want to apologize for my behavior during my recent trip to London," one version began. "While I intended to create a lighthearted moment that would bring attention to cultural differences between our nations, I realize now that my approach was inappropriate and disrespectful." He deleted that draft and started again. "As someone who has dedicated his career to public service, I deeply regret that my actions in London have overshadowed the important work I have been doing for my constituents." That version lasted until he realized it made him sound delusional about both his current standing and his past accomplishments. The hardest call came Friday morning, when Marcus finally worked up the courage to phone his wife. Carol's voice was colder than he had ever heard it, each word delivered with surgical precision designed to cause maximum emotional damage. "I've been watching the news coverage," she said without preamble. "I've been reading the analysis pieces about what kind of person would do something like this. I've been thinking about our marriage and whether I ever really knew the man I was living with." Marcus tried to interrupt with apologies and explanations, but Carol cut him off with the authority of someone who had reached the end of their patience. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't try to spin this like it's some kind of political attack or media bias. I watched the video, Marcus. I saw you assault that young man. I saw you act like a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. And then I realized that this is who you've become. Someone so desperate for attention that you'll hurt other people to get it." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but Marcus could tell that Carol had already made her decision. When she mentioned that she had contacted a divorce attorney, it felt like the final piece of his old life crumbling away. The political career might be salvageable, he had told himself throughout the week, but losing Carol made him confront the possibility that some damage couldn't be undone. Meanwhile, Lance Corporal Mitchell had become something of a folk hero. British media had tracked down interviews with his family and former military colleagues, all of whom praised his professionalism and restraint in dealing with Marcus's assault. A GoFundMe campaign started by admirers had raised thousands of pounds for military charities in his name, despite his requests that people stop making him the center of attention. The contrast between the two men's post-incident trajectories could not have been more stark. Mitchell returned to his normal duty rotation, receiving commendations from his superiors and respect from his peers for handling a difficult situation with textbook precision. Marcus, meanwhile, was discovering that viral infamy was much harder to escape than viral fame was to achieve. Friday evening brought news that felt like the final nail in the coffin of Marcus's political aspirations. The State Ethics Committee announced that they would be launching an investigation into whether his London trip constituted misuse of public resources, despite Marcus's insistence that he had paid for everything personally. More damaging still was the announcement from his own political party that they would be re-evaluating their support for his gubernatorial campaign. The hotel's business center, where Marcus had retreated to print his boarding pass and handle last-minute arrangements, provided an unwelcome reminder of his new reality. Other guests using the computers immediately recognized him, their whispered conversations and barely concealed stares making it clear that he had achieved a level of notoriety that would follow him far beyond London. As Marcus prepared for his journey home, he began to understand that the most challenging part of his ordeal was just beginning. The viral video would eventually fade from social media feeds, replaced by newer outrages and fresher scandals. But the political consequences, the personal relationships destroyed, and the reputation permanently damaged would linger much longer than his broken wrist would take to heal. His last night in London was spent staring out the hotel window at the lights of a city that had become the setting for his spectacular downfall. Somewhere across town, Lance Corporal Mitchell was probably sleeping peacefully, his conscience clear and his future secure. Marcus, meanwhile, was planning his return to a home state where he had become a laughingstock, a marriage that was ending, and a political career that existed now only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of desperate ambition. The man who had come to London seeking viral fame was returning as a viral failure, and the difference between those two outcomes was about to reshape everything he thought he knew about success, failure, and the true cost of public humiliation. The return. The airplane wheels touching down at the airport felt less like a homecoming and more like arriving at the scene of an execution. Marcus Wellington kept his baseball cap pulled low and his broken wrist tucked close to his body as he navigated through the terminal, but anonymity was no longer possible for someone whose face had been broadcast around the world in high-definition humiliation. A small crowd of reporters waited at baggage claim, their cameras ready, and their questions sharp. Marcus had hoped to slip through unnoticed, but his distinctive cast and the unmistakable posture of someone trying to hide made him instantly recognizable. The questions came rapid-fire as soon as he was spotted. "Mr. Wellington, do you have any regrets about your actions in London?" shouted one reporter, thrusting a microphone toward his face. "Will you be dropping out of the gubernatorial race?" called another. "What do you say to constituents who are calling for your resignation?" came a third voice from the growing crowd. Marcus mumbled no comment repeatedly while hurrying toward the exit, but his pace was slowed by his luggage and his injury. The reporters followed, their cameras capturing every moment of his obvious distress. This footage would become another viral moment, the defeated politician skulking through his own hometown airport like a criminal trying to avoid capture. The drive home revealed the full extent of his fall from grace. Campaign signs bearing his name and smiling photograph, which had once filled him with pride, now seemed to mock him from every street corner. Someone had defaced several of them with crude graffiti, turning his campaign slogan, "Wellington working for you," into "Wellington wrecked in London." Local radio stations were still discussing the incident, with call-in shows providing a platform for constituents to express their disappointment and anger. His house, when he finally reached it, felt like foreign territory. Carol's car was gone from the driveway, and several boxes sat stacked on the front porch. A note taped to the front door, written in Carol's precise handwriting, explained that she had taken temporary residence with her sister and that the boxes contained his personal items from her home office. Inside, the house echoed with emptiness. Carol had removed not just her belongings but anything that suggested a shared life. Photographs that had shown the couple at political events and family gatherings were gone, leaving clean rectangles on the walls where they had once hung. The roar. Silence was broken only by the answering machine, which blinked with 47 unheard messages. Marcus played the messages while unpacking his London luggage with his one good hand. The calls ranged from reporters seeking comment to former supporters expressing their disappointment. His mother's voice, hurt and confused, asked why she had to learn about his troubles from the evening news. His brother, typically blunt, simply said, "What the hell were you thinking, Marcus?" But it was the call from his campaign treasurer that delivered the most devastating news. Donations had not just stopped flowing. Previous donors were demanding refunds. Event venues were canceling bookings. The campaign headquarters lease was being terminated early due to what the landlord called reputational concerns that might affect other tenants. Within a week of his return, Marcus's entire political infrastructure had collapsed. Staff members found new jobs or returned to previous employers. The campaign website was taken down. Social media accounts were suspended after being overwhelmed by negative comments and mocking memes. What had taken years to build was dismantled in a matter of days. The state ethics investigation proceeded swiftly, though its findings were almost anticlimactic, given the comprehensive destruction already wrought by public opinion. While they determined that no public funds had been misused for the London trip, the committee's report included language about conduct unbecoming and serious lapses in judgment that would follow Marcus for the rest of his political career. His resignation from the state legislature came 3 weeks after his return, though by that point it was largely a formality. The governor had already begun the process of calling for a special election to fill his seat. Local party officials had made it clear that his continued presence was harming the entire organization's reputation. The resignation letter, carefully crafted by a lawyer friend, expressed regret without admitting wrongdoing. But nobody was fooled by the diplomatic language. The financial consequences proved almost as devastating as the political ones. Legal fees for the ethics investigation and divorce proceedings consumed most of his savings. The house purchased during more optimistic times when a gubernatorial victory seemed possible now carried a mortgage that his current income couldn't support. Marcus was forced to take a job with a small law firm that specialized in personal injury cases, a far cry from the constitutional law practice he had imagined for his post-political career. 6 months after London, Marcus encountered Jenny at a coffee shop downtown. She was working for his former primary opponent, who had easily won the election to fill his legislative seat. The conversation was awkward, but not hostile, marked by the complicated emotions that arise when someone who once believed in you watches you destroy yourself. "I keep thinking there might have been a way to prevent all this," Jenny said, stirring her coffee nervously. "Maybe if I had pushed back harder when you started talking about desperate measures. Maybe if I had threatened to quit earlier." Marcus assured her that the choices had been his alone, which was true but didn't alleviate either of their discomfort with how everything had unfolded. She mentioned that Lance Corporal Mitchell had completed his service and was now working in private security, having turned down multiple interview requests and book deal offers. Even in the aftermath of their encounter, the young soldier had maintained the dignity that Marcus had so catastrophically failed to demonstrate. A year later, the viral video still occasionally resurfaces during slow news cycles, usually accompanied by analysis about the dangers of social media fame or the pressures facing modern politicians. Marcus has learned to live with the knowledge that his moment of greatest public visibility will forever be associated with his moment of greatest personal failure. He now works quietly at the law firm, handling cases that rarely make the news, and avoiding any situation that might draw public attention. The cast came off his wrist months ago, but he still favors that hand slightly. A permanent reminder of the day he learned the difference between breaking someone else's composure and breaking himself. Sometimes, late at night, Marcus wonders what might have happened if he had simply stayed home that week, focused on the issues his constituents actually cared about, and built his political career on substance rather than spectacle. But those thoughts lead nowhere productive, and he has learned that dwelling on alternative histories is just another form of the desperate thinking that led him to London in the first place. The man who once dreamed of governing a state now processes personal injury claims and tries to rebuild a life that fame destroyed more thoroughly than obscurity ever could. It turns out that getting the world's attention is easy. Learning to live without it is the much harder challenge.